Welcome to the only daily podcast focusing on compliance news of the day. Each morning, start your day with a cup of coffee and Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, to hear about 4 of the top compliance, corruption, or leadership stories you will need to start your day. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
September 10, 2020, the bad day for M&A edition. First up, TikTok is in discussions with the U.S. government about possible arrangements which allow the popular video sharing app to avoid a full sale of its U.S. operations. Such discussions around an option have risen in prominence since the Chinese government took steps to make sale to a U.S. technology giant much more difficult. That would place against the fast approaching deadline that President Trump laid down via fiat. So as with all things the Trump administration, it's complete chaos, or as the Wall Street Journal says, the situation is fluid. So it's possible a sale would happen, but it's also possible that it won't. Next up, in really no surprise to anyone, the French luxury goods giant LVMH has pulled out of its $16.2 billion takeover of Tiffany in a sign of trade tensions and how the coronavirus pandemic has taken the air out of the high-flying luxury industry. This is really interesting because I think compliance practitioners need to consider, were you involved in a potential deal before the pandemic? And if it falls through, what does that mean from a risk profile? We all think about buying perhaps distressed assets or something going forward, but what happens if you have to pull out of a deal? Next up, from the New York Times, Facebook may be ordered to change data practices in Europe. Irish regulators have started an inquiry into Facebook's movement of data on European users to the United States. Facebook is facing the prospect of not being able to move data about its European users to the U.S. after EU regulators raised questions that these transfers do not adequately protect that information from the U.S. government. Let me just say here for the record, there is no protection against the U.S. government if Facebook has that information. Facebook said that the Irish Data Protection Commission has begun an inquiry of its movement, and it can fine, obviously, Facebook up to 4% of its global revenue. Facebook may have to now overhaul its operations in Europe to keep European data stored within Europe. Gee. Why is that unusual to require Facebook to follow GDPR? Oh, well, I guess Facebook just didn't think it applied to them. They don't think any other law applies to them. So it's going to be interesting to see how Facebook responds on this front, but clearly they are not in compliance with GDPR, particularly after the end of Privacy Shield. And finally, also from the New York Times, how did quarantine kill the weekend? If you're like me, every day now ends in the letter Y, not just weekdays, not weekends. They're all the same. And what has that meant for your work life? Recognizing you don't have to wake up early for a commute or sit at a desk all day, but you get up, have a cup of coffee, go into your office at home. So obviously the best part of working remotely is simply that. What happens when that remoteness transforms into something more nefarious, where you're basically on call 24/7, and your supervisors respect no boundaries going forward because, of course, senior executives respect no boundaries. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow.